Hello out there. My name is Luke Boyd. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs at Historic Richmond Town on Staten Island. Welcome to another installation of Arts and Culture in Quarantine. Welcome to my library. I want to tell you about some of the books that I have in my collection that I think are interesting and are worth sharing or worth reading for sure. First, I want to give a shout out to our Executive Director Jessica Phillips, our Diversity Coordinator Sarah Clark, and our Diversity Intern, DEI Intern Dominic Hood for sharing wonderful aspects of their collections. Sarah Clark beat me to the punch, but any New York historian, any scholar, any student, any guide should be conversant in this book. Of course, it is Gotham by Edwin Burrows and Mike Wallace. It's a biblical text about the history of New York. It only gets you, it's a brief history, as it says, of New York City to 1898. This only gets you to 1898. When you know all the other boroughs would join with Manhattan. So 1898 is the Incorporation Act when all the other boroughs join, including Staten Island. There is incredible detail in this book. There's a wonderful index in which you can look up all sorts of subjects. And of course you can find a lot about Staten Island in this book. You can find information about the British experience colonizing and holding Staten Island. You can learn about slavery on the island. You can learn about farming and agriculture on the island. All that's covered in that wonderful book. But there's a lot of other books out there as well. So one I'd like to tell you about is very special to me. This is Forgotten New York by Kevin Walsh. This is a fantastic field guide to New York City. In fact, the subtitle of the book is The Ultimate Urban Explorer's Guide to New York City, to the 5 boroughs. And if you're an urban explorer, you are someone who is interested in aspects of our built environment, things that are perhaps abandoned, underused, things that are not you're not allowed to see, all those kinds of things. But Kevin Walsh not just explores the abandoned, he explores the sort of secret history lurking behind everything around us, from lamp posts to the traces of old buildings that were left behind and built over. All sorts of material is in here. And Kevin Walsh does have a chapter dedicated to each borough. And of course, in the Staten Island chapter, there's a lovely section on historic Richmond Town, and it provides a great sort of quick and dirty guide to many of the contributing structures that we have on the property. So I would highly recommend Forgotten New York. I've used it as sort of a field guide myself, sort of checking off things one by one as I found them. The book is a few years old, so I made little notes. If descriptions in the book are sort of out of date, I would update them. So urban exploration is a great way to find interest in what's all around us. Sometimes we think about tourism and traveling as leaving town or going somewhere far away, but you can be sort of a tourist in New York with a book like that, which I think is really fascinating. On the heels of Forgotten New York, I want to talk about another book, Weird New York. This is a really fun book. It's, again, like a travel book, Roadside America, and it's about New York State, not just New York City. Chris Gethard is the primary author. Chris Gethard, of course, comes from New Jersey, but he's a comedian and writer operating in New York City. He worked with the Upright Citizens Brigade, so there's a kind of punchy quality to this book. It's really, really funny. There's a great section about the potential sighting of Bigfoot on Staten Island, and according to this book, Bigfoot was sighted in the 1970s in historic Richmond Town area adjacent. So if you have any information on the sighting of Bigfoot, please let us know. It's an excellent book. So I don't often read fiction, but when I do, I am always reminded of how much I enjoy it. One book that really sort of took my breath away was The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. If you've read The Wonder Boys or have seen that movie with Michael Douglas, Michael Chabon is an excellent writer, and this book is fascinating. It's, of course, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. It's a fictitious story about 2 Jewish American boys growing up in Queens before and after World War II. So it has a lot of richness to it, great detail growing up in Queens and New York City in that time. It's a New York book, so we have a lot of great backdrop setting of New York City. It's very evocative of that time period. This is one of those books where you not only get wrapped up in the story, you want to see like where it's going, you also are so invested in these characters that are so lifelike that you want them to exist, and are sort of saddened when you remember that they don't. The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, fantastic book. A little bit of the backstory: it's two boys growing up in Queens who get wrapped up in the comic book industry, and their own Jewish American culture is reflected in the comics that they develop. It's fascinating. It's really interesting stuff. Another sort of straight history text. This is called The Brown Decades by Lewis Mumford. Lewis Mumford was a historian of the 20th century. He was looking back at the 19th century, the 1800s, when he was writing this book. This is a small survey of arts and culture in America from 1865 to 1895. So we would categorize that as the Victorian age in America. And what Lewis Mumford is putting forward here is an understanding of the American aesthetic after the Civil War. The idea that Lewis Mumford puts forward is that the Civil War, a massive trauma, a tragedy in the American psyche, would be processed through architecture, through art, through literature, all those creative expressions. And there's a melancholy that sort of spills over into all of that. And it's also reflected in the colors that we would see from that time period. Think about the brownstones of New York City. Literally, the brown decades. That's the sort of brown aesthetic. Let me read a portion of Mumford's book to you that might bring this to light. Now he's talking about the history of the United States as seasons of change, like long periods of time. There was such a violent, stormy summer, and such a sudden push of autumn in the period of American history that began with the Civil War. The long winter of the 17th century, a sturdy battle with the elements, had given way to the slow spring of the 18th. It was then that the ground was plowed and the country made ready for a new political system and a new relationship to the institutions and customs of the past. Then, in the few warm weeks that elapsed between 1830 and 1860, there had come a quick leafing and efflorescence in the literary works of Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau, Melville, Hawthorne. New modes of thought and a fresh sense of human adventure became apparent. If there were few early fruits, the flowers were delectable and their promise abundant. The Civil War shook down the blossoms and blasted the promise of spring. The colors of American civilization abruptly changed. By the time the war was over, browns had spread everywhere. Mediocre drabs, dingy chocolate browns, sooty browns that merged into black. Autumn had come. Lewis Mumford's ideas have aged not without controversy in the ideas of historians, but I think it's a really interesting mode of thought to think about history as seasons of change, long periods, and the sort of colors that are determined in our history. Really fascinating stuff. And my final plug here in this retrospective is a really fun book that I have in my collection, and it's called Boilerplate, History's Mechanical Marvel by Paul Guinan. This is a really fun book. It is a picture book. Essentially, it's a steampunk sort of fictitious history book. So the idea is that Boilerplate is a historical made-up character, a robot, who is built in the 1890s. Think about steampunk technology, a reimagining of the past with technology. And so these authors take real historical photographs, real historical moments, and they insert boilerplate into those stories. And so Boilerplate becomes a mechanical soldier, arbiter of peace, if you were. And he is discovered in this new history written by these guys all over the place. And so the book is really fun. It's got a lot of great pictures and text. It's a really fun book for kids. Similarly to the other book, you want Boilerplate to be real. On the back here, you can see here's Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and Boilerplate has been inserted right here. So this is a really fun book. Again, history need not be a rote recitation of facts and figures. Historical imagination is what this is all about. So I hope you found these books fascinating, interesting, intriguing. Even though the libraries are physically closed, you can still rent and take out ebooks from your local library. Check out the New York Public Library's website, nypl.org, for more information. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of our Arts and Culture in Quarantine series. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. Take care, folks.